Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to talk about the season 4 season finale. The 2 hour finanza that wasn't exactly must see because ultimately, really, you didn't have to tune in until the last hour of these 2 hours. Even if you really wanted to legitimately do that, you honestly could have waited the last half hour just seeing everyone unmasked and ultimately just been like, yeah, what a show. You reasonably didn't need to see 2 hours of this, but reasonably, if you did, God bless you, I guess. Because, man, it was an entire season recap with the exclusion of having every single person come in and sing, which they already technically did that at some other episode, recapping before. So it's basically a recap on top of a recap. And I'm just like, oakley dokley there, fair neighbors. But anyways, I'm sure there's a whole reason for the otherwise not exactly new content that is otherwise arriving into this Masked Singer, because reasonably, I guess they naturally assumed that nobody watched the episodes before and they're just tuning in now for this season finale, or otherwise, justifiably, you might have missed an episode here or there. Dot, 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 dot. Reasonably, probably also the reason why for the skittish content would ultimately be for what Game Grumps would usually call the Backstreet Boys World Tour. And what I would call the Cove, or because of the new normal situation, would normally lead lesser or fewer content within a lot of things. To where ultimately they just double down on stuff that's already had pre-existing and edited cleverly and this and that. Like a 2 hour voice season finale. It's like, man, so now you no longer need to watch the entire season, even if it's on Hulu. You just need to watch the very last episode and just be like, oh yeah, I knew it was that person. I knew it was that person. Yep, that person is correct. So now that I've gotten that off of my chest, in somewhere, put in a chest somewhere, locked away, thrown away the key, now ultimately let's go into these last three people, ultimately judge them harshly, judge them wildly, and shake fists a lot for reasons I don't quite understand. But now, so, who have I thought was the Crocodile? Ultimately, I'm going to tell you exactly which runner-up had gotten run down into these three different slots of course, getting the bronze, of course, getting the silver, and of course, going for the Masked Singer Award Gold. So, very first off, we have in, sadly, the third place, we ultimately have the bronzed man, ultimately the Crocodile. So, reasonably, as course per usual, this might seem as a review at this point, we ultimately have a man that I've been saying since the beginning of this season, maybe a little bit of a man called Nick Carter. Ultimately, within this show, I was really thinking of other people as well, of who this Crocodile could be, because ultimately I had a lot of time to kill within these 2 hours. So I immediately also, when looking at the Crocodile, I'm like, could it be possible that the Crocodile could quite possibly be Darth Vader? There's some times when, like, I can easily confuse the Crocodile with a Darth Vader. And so, and ultimately, I love me some James Earl Jones, or maybe even Hayden Christensen from some of the younger audience out there. So, reasonably, I was also thinking the Crocodile, honestly, to me, was the Darth Vader. And so, reasonably, I just thought that I had to throw that in there, throw that in the gate. But also, I couldn't wait to also naturally assume that maybe the mushroom is double downing on their masked ability. And maybe I was thinking whoever was the mushroom was also the Crocodile. I thought you don't see the mushroom and the crocodile always in exactly the same room at the same time all the time. So maybe they just doubled down on the. You could have just a mannequin in the crocodile suit and no one would know. So I'm thinking maybe the mushroom doubled down on being the crocodile. But cementingly, I was just like, you know what, this Nick Carter guy, I think there's something up with this. Reasonably, I also saw that the clue package for the crocodile, the cookies, was blue and black. And ultimately it was hearts. I didn't know what the hearts were, but I knew what the I eventually realized later on after this whole footage was done and over with, what blue and black meant, because I had to look it up afterwards. And so reasonably, I still assessed by any guess that this was Nick Carter. I wasn't swaying at any day of any time of any point that it was anyone else other than Nick Carter. And so reasonably, I hope by the end of the show, you will know if I was correct and or wrong, by ultimately going into the song and dance of me showcasing to you who by unmascotted name who had been unmasked, and if I was right or wrong, and then a seasonal recap of me just ultimately just saying, man, I was horribly wrong for this season. Horribly wrong. And I'm sorry. I'm gonna eat some crow at the end of this episode. And I know it's coming, I know it's gonna happen. And there it is. Already. Moving on. So ultimately for the mushroom, I had ultimately said on the very last episode, I'm like, hey, maybe it is Joshua Fisher, I believe is his name. Ultimately, yeah, that's who I assessed it was. It seems like the judges were both going for Aloe Blacc, I believe is his name. And I guess you can kind of go with that consensus of ultimately when two judges are ultimately saying the same name is normally where you would go with. But I was also assessing maybe some frame of mind that ultimately the mushroom could honestly have been Mario. Super Mario, Mario Brothers, whatever variation that you would like him to be. I believe Mario's last name is Mario Luigi because ultimately Luigi's name is Luigi Mario. So Mario Luigi, ultimately, I have had my sights sought out at Mario, because ultimately Mushroom Mario, it feels like a sweet, delicious fit. And so recently I'm like, maybe Mario went rogue and he's like, you know what? I want to look like Toad for once. And that's what I want to do. So maybe it's Mario. And I was like, oh my God, what if that could quite possibly be the route of which this thing goes about going into? I don't know. Moving on. Again, I'd have a little fun because this was 2 hours of The Masked Singer, and so reasonably I had to make jokes into this because reasonably it was just like, God, there's nothing better to do but just to wait around for this show to eventually end and pretend that I didn't feel that. I was like, God, everyone only sang once. If anything, the songs were just kind of okay. We had a song sung by Crocodile that was a Journey song, Open Arms. We had the Mushroom who sang his Stevie Wonder song, I Wish, which I was like, this kind of sounds like Earth, Wind, and Fire's Shining Star. And then ultimately for the Sun song, which I was like, okay, this is kind of a weird song. And I'm like, I don't know how I'm feeling about it. It was a song called The Story. And I was like, yeah, I don't quite know. I'm not really familiar with this one. reasonably the song was dedicated to the one that she loved, and so that was great. At least we got to know the son was a she if we couldn't have figured that out by day one. But so reasonably, when going into the guessing of this, I didn't take any random guesses. I could have honestly went with uh, Nicole Scherzinger, who ultimately people might know might have at some point been the lead singer of the Pussycat Dolls. I think she was also a judge on the show called The Masked Singer. And so that was ultimately like where I was kind of like thinking in my brain that ultimately like that could maybe quite possibly be the son at some point. And I was like, man, if only that Nicole person, like I want to hope that she's actually the son, and I think that she should be. And but I'm like, you know what, there's probably a hitch in that problem that will ultimately make me think that there's no way that this Nicole person could ultimately also be on this Masked Singer show, but I'm trying to figure out what that problem is, but I have yet to figure that out yet. So we ultimately have two other people that I guess have to just be like just ultimate other guesses, because that whole Nicole thing is really bugging me, but we'll get to that later at some point. So I guess we just have to force these two other guesses out there just to see if they work. So we ultimately have, of course, Leanne Rimes, who ultimately has done the movie Coyote Ugly, ultimately singing the song Can't Fight the Moonlight. So ultimately, I'm like, okay, so she quite possibly did a song called Can't Fight the Moonlight. So ultimately, maybe that is ironic. Maybe that she could possibly be the sun in a hilarious joke-like fashion. Maybe. Who knows? Hopefully the sun wins this, because ultimately we have in bronze-like fashion the mushroom, and now we have the winner now as the sun. So ultimately, now it's just left up to unmasking at this point. If ultimately Christina Aguilera is also the sun, maybe they have duo suits going on, and recently they switch between Christina Aguilera and Leanne Rimes, and like people will be utterly confused who would it be. But ultimately, yeah, these two guesses, or Nicole even adding as a three guess, but again, I just couldn't put myself to have a picture of Nicole on here, because again, that whole like I was really questioning that guess, but recently I was like, you know what? How about I ultimately just kind of like just say it out there, just say it out loud. So now I'm going to talk about the Golden Ear. If ultimately you have heard about this whole award thing, where you have people being first impressioned in to ultimately win a Golden Ear within the judges, I'm going to let you know who is that person that ultimately won that for this season. And then ultimately we are going to get to every single unmasking via which of these people were unmasked via the show. So ultimately, and then we're going to go into a season recap of me just either giving myself crap, or ultimately just saying, yay, for me, I guess, for 2 hours of this. So let's go into talking about the Golden Ear, because ultimately I don't have a photo of that, but I will tell you who had gotten it. So if you don't want to be spoiled further on into this show, you can go onto Hulu and watch it for 2 hours if you want to, or be a reasonable person and watch probably the last 30 minutes and you'll probably know who everyone was. Or you can probably just go on YouTube and watch all the unleashings and unmaskings and singings and dancings and such. So, I'm going to talk about the Golden Ear right now. So, the Golden Ear ultimately won by McCarthy. So, just Jennifer McCarthy Wahlberg ultimately won the Golden Ear by reasonably having 4 to everyone's either 2 or none or 1 or whatever. Because ultimately, yeah, a lot of people's first impressions weren't actually the person or people they went with. And so reasonably, we have Jenny, who ultimately said right out of the gate for the Crocodile that her first impression was Nick Carter, which I was like, okay, well, that's a little bit goofy. I'm like, what the heck? Like, why is it that, like, she picked that but didn't say anything? Or maybe when sometimes the judges have the right answers, ultimately maybe they get edited out, or they ultimately just have that first impression but ultimately don't say anything. I think that's kind of dumb. Like, I guess to sway or say, hey, yeah, like, I have this kind of like under my hat that eventually I will use, and this and that. But anyways, so reasonably, Jenny had gotten the ear, the good old fashioned ear in here. But it seems like all of her other guesses for this episode may or may not have been right. So justifiably, yeah, we'll have to see that in a second here when we unmask every 3 mounts of these people. And ultimately, you already know who won, which is the sun. And so now we are now going to unmask every single person. Again, Hulu to check this out, but without a doubt, we are going to unmask every single person right now, in the row of which that they had gotten their medals of sorts. So now, double a 5 count to ultimately tell you we are spoiling every single unmasking right now. Ultimately, the Crocodile was Nick Carter. So ultimately, we have the black and blue hearts for the cookies. What does that have anything to do with this man right here? Well, ultimately, there was an album for Backstreet Boys that was actually called Black and Blue, in those same exact colors. Ultimately, the album, I think one of the songs was The Call that was on that album. I don't know what significance that album had, but I just recently was just kind of like backpedaling through like a song of the Backstreet Boys, just to be reminded of some song, and I ended up like realizing that's, oh yeah, Black and Blue. I guess that was the reference to that. But anyways, to me, honestly, for the longest time, I knew, 1, that Nick Carter was in Edward Scissorhands, 2, that he was in This Is the End, with a number of cast members and stuff along those lines, which ultimately, in time, just made me consistently consent to the fact that it was Nick Carter. Every single one of the New Kids on the Block references was just to put a shadow or put a sway to otherwise say, hey, yeah, I toured with them at some point, but that doesn't mean I am one of them. Recently, they kept getting closer and closer to a Backstreet Boys character, but it seems like every single time they went with either Howie or they went with AJ. They didn't go with Kevin or they didn't go with Brian. So I guess they just didn't go with the one actual person that from day one sounded like Nick Carter. Reasonably, I've rarely, like, I'm more of a person that tries to listen to like Linkin Park's or Daughtry's or Cold Driven or some other stuff that I've heard. But every once in a while, I'll slip in a weird and or bizarre music choice that ultimately I regret having. But recently, every once in a while, I'll go back to hearing the song "The Call" from Backstreet Boys every once in a while. sadly a guilty pleasure of mine, but otherwise, like, reasonably, yeah, because ultimately, I kind of know what that song is about. Recently, having meaning a girl, kind of doing a little bit of cheating, I guess. Because who cares? Like, I guess morally, it's like, oh, you're thinking if you have a girlfriend, you're gonna cheat on. No, because that's stupid. Like, if anything, there's not a fantasy there. There's not a care in the world about doing that kind of thing. It's just always funny to hear that kind of bizarre song about cheating, and because ultimately, it's like, dude, you have the milk at home. Like, why are you buying a carton anyways? That seems kind of like stupid to me. Um, but anyways, Nick Carter is the crocodile. Moving on to who is now the mushroom. Ultimately, the mushroom was probably the hardest to figure out who that was. And so, because realistically, it probably did come down to the wire for the mushroom. It ultimately seemed like it was like I was never going to figure this guy out. Ultimately, we are going to figure out who this was right now. Aloe, what the heck is going on with my voice? Aloe Blacc, Grammy nominated singer, songwriter, and record producer. I don't know much about Aloe Blacc, but it seems dear in fact when two judges ultimately say a name, you're just like, yeah, there's something about this that always seems right when that happens. Very rarely do you get two judges that say the same name and it ends up not being that person. So when looking at it, this one was not in my Rolodex of knowledge, but oh well, when looking at it, I didn't have to go with this guess either. But still, like, this season has been a pretty good season to me. So ultimately, if I were to ultimately just say, hey, yeah, I can count this as being wrong for me because I ultimately didn't know this person, that is completely 100% fine. Moving on to the unmasking of the winner of season 4 right now. Leanne Rimes, Grammy winning singer, songwriter, and actress. I'm not even going to say that I know anything about Aloe Blacc, but Leanne Rimes, I probably don't really know much of either of Leanne Rimes either. Besides the fact that she was in the movie Coyote Ugly, that's the only thing that I really know. Ultimately, I have heard her song called Blue. I remember fairly young her getting an award, and I that was, like, honestly for me the only thing that I remember. I also know Leanne Rimes was in the Mickey Mouse Club at some point. That was the reference of the Mickey Mouse symbol. And so recently, that's otherwise why I tied myself to this character or to this person for a very long time. And plus, it also helped that she sounded really good, anyways. So at the end of the day, Leanne Rimes had won this show, and I am so happy for her because when looking at it, reasonably, it was just like she was always a good singer. It was just that eventually, like, she just did smaller and smaller projects, and then just kind of faded away into the ether of things. And so, hopefully, maybe her winning this show will get her back into doing some projects again, or maybe just kind of just doing another album or anything like that, or something. Hopefully that people will enjoy and get behind, and otherwise be like, yeah, we loved her on the show, so now we get to see her here and enjoy her for her winning this show. So now let's get into a seasonal recap. If you have not seen this entire season, for reasons I will not feel sorry for you, because these 2 hours basically told you everything about this entire season. So reasonably, I'm not going to say, oh, spoilers coming up for the season recap, because reasonably these 2 hours recapped everything. Every single thing of the season was shown within these 2 hours. So not with the exclusion of actual songs and stuff like that, which can be covered onto YouTube. So, seasonal recap right now. So, yes, this is yet another season where ultimately, basically, for the most point, pretty much a winning season. I think there was only probably 3 out of everyone that ultimately I could ultimately say I absolutely got wrong. But reasonably, they were kind of wild, random guesses, anyways. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I was kind of going for the majority rather than the I hope I get every single thing correct. Maybe next season, I might have to try to push for that. But when looking at it, I think probably more per season. Like, I think I tend to get more correct than incorrect. So when looking at it, I think I can just ultimately say I think last season was so like I was on pins and needles the whole entire time, just going like, oh, I hope I can pull this one out. Because ultimately, I was getting like half of them correct and half of them incorrect, and I was sweating. I was like, "Oh my god, am I gonna get this right this season? Oh my god, this is a horrible season." But now with this season, I was like, "Oh, I felt like a little bit easier with some of the guesses for me." I know a lot of people could ultimately say it's like, well, yeah, because a lot of the judges picked your things as well, and you just went with theirs, which that's okay too. Um, because recently in the very first season, like I had so many guesses correct that the judges were nowhere near on, which ultimately I haven't ever reviewed that, and like ultimately I might have to just go through the first season of like, yeah, whatever guess that I had originally, I'm gonna have to remember what all those were and go with them, and then like replay the whole first season all over again just to kind of uh, tell people how I kind of figured everything out. Uh, and then I think I went into the second season, and like that season was a lot harder. And I think that was the. I'm trying to think here. Uh, I think the third season was the. Yeah, the second season was the Rottweiler season, and so ultimately I know I did pretty well on that one. And then we have the third season, which ultimately was ultimately the turtle season, and so yeah, I think I got most of those eventually right. I think reasonably that season had to really be a little bit more Google heavy than I wanted it to be. I think the Rottweiler season was one where I didn't really need to Google much. I think even the first season wasn't something that that I really needed to Google anybody. I think this season reason I think was another season where I didn't have to like. I think there was probably like some like questioning of like, well, maybe it could be this person, or maybe it just so happened to have a photo somewhere where I was googling things. But I didn't go out of my way for this season to search much for anybody, with the exclusion of just like remembering about somebody and then just going, okay, let's look into that further afterwards, after the show was over. Um, and so reasonably, yeah, luckily, most of these people I kind of luckily was able to know somehow via either one song or two, or luckily I went with some judges' consensuses or changed who I thought people might have been based on some judge guessing. But that could ultimately be like, I guess, a factor of like, well, did you go with the judge's decision this season? Which, yeah, probably more than likely I probably have more than in the past, because most of the time I would ultimately just like call them like, I would ultimately tell them like, yeah, like these guesses are a joke, and you guys suck at guessing. And like I would make fun of the judges, and like this season I feel bad about that, that I made fun of them so often, just like, God, why aren't you picking this the whole entire season? Why aren't you picking this the entire time? And like this season, they were so much more right on, like through this entire season than I was at some points. So I went with their guesses, and I was like, you know what? I feel like there's something in the force of my mind that ultimately like feels like they are right about something. And in seasons past, I would have been like, dude, like no, like I'm just gonna go with my own guess, and that's probably gonna be horribly wrong or horribly right for a good way. But honestly, I think the stickouts really to me this season were probably the Snow Owls. Man, were they actually kind of really fun being on here. Taylor Dane was really fun to ultimately see eventually when she got unmasked. I was like, heck yeah! I'm like, they had mentioned her on seasons before, and it's great to finally see her now. Uh, I think probably Bob Saget was kind of fun to eventually find him being on the show, because I couldn't, like I knew that ultimately through interviews that he does a lot of gigs and stuff like that. He has like fun with John Stamos and stuff like that, kind of riffing and doing like kind of things and stuff like that. But yeah, I didn't realize that otherwise Bob Saget would maybe quite possibly be on here. But then when looking at it, I was like, well, maybe because ultimately he is also on the I Can See Your Voice. So recently I was like, well, probably anybody that is also on I Can See Your Voice is probably also going to be on this show as a masked person. So recently, I guess it's like, well, that's the easy way to ultimately say that, oh, well, anybody that's going to be on that show is going to be on The Masked Singer probably. So I might as well just guess that it's probably going to be any number of those people. Uh, Other than that, yeah, like there were recently a lot of people that I think Tori Kelly was the only one that I really wasn't really familiar with, even if it seemed like I was familiar with this person. I'm like, I don't know jack about this girl. I think really Google, when I was searching through Seahorse, anyways, people were guessing it was Tori Kelly, and that's all I went with. And so I was like, okay, sure, I guess let's go with this consensus because I don't know who Tori Kelly is. And recently, I don't think I'm going to be any more closer to knowing who Tori Kelly is after the show ends. But I did like her songs. I did like the things that she did in the show, and I hope she goes on to give me a song that I will enjoy and that I will like. So yeah, so let's hope for that. So yeah, that's all I could say about this season. I guess another winning season. Recently, there was a lot of characters that a lot of people would say, "Oh, you just went with the judges." There were some times where really I could finally make the consensus, because ultimately, like the Serpent was a guy from Minnesota, and ultimately that was like, yeah, I'm actually really familiar with this person because he showed him all the time because he lived in Minnesota. Uh, Ultimately, the gremlin who was Mickey Rourke, like easily, I was just like, yeah, like there's a wrestler, and like, okay, this is kind of a rebellious character. Easy enough to figure that out, but without a doubt, yeah, it was like, I was like, oh wow, would Mickey Rourke really be on the show? But evidently he was. So yeah, that's all I had to say about this season. Like Dragon being unmasked first, kind of sucked. It was like, but I'm looking at it like Buster Rhymes was a really cool character to be on the show, and I like the fact that he was on here, so that was great. So yeah, a winning season, I guess. Now we have to wait till freaking what is it, like April or something for this show to come back, April or May or something for this show to eventually be a thing yet again. Uh, because we have to watch The Masked Dancer now. I do not think I'm going to like if ultimately I watch The Masked Singer, I don't know if I'm going to review The Masked Singer. I don't think I can justifiably review The Masked Singer. I don't know about dancing, and so I don't think I will be able to figure out anybody. And if I like, that would be a very difficult show for me to even want to do, just because I'm like, I've probably seen So You Think You Can Dance. I've seen kind of Dancing with the Stars a little bit, some sorts here and there, but I don't think I'd want to do Masked Dancer. But ultimately, maybe if there are people that are interested enough, because probably nothing better to do on whatever night that Masked Dancer falls onto. I just don't think that I really want to do the Masked Dancer. I just don't think I. Anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Hopefully, you guys liked this review. It was about the amount of time that you would get to see everybody unmasked within the last 2 hours. So, ultimately, I'm going to get out of here. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed this season finale. But I'm going to finale out of here and ultimately wait for probably another Masked Singer to eventually come down months down the road. I don't know. I guess I can just kind of like really just. I know I'm going to be talking a lot more about probably like Christmas films and stuff like that, but ultimately I'll probably just be reviewing a lot of other stuff as well. So yeah, I will be out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.